A haunting presence, the crunch of giant footsteps, and a testimony from a highly respected climber. Something weird is afoot at the summit of Ben MacDui. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. Today we're looking at the mystery of the Grey Man of Ben MacDui, known in Gaelic as Fear Liath Mor. Ben MacDui, the highest mountain in the Cairngorms and the second highest in the UK, a remote wilderness of snow, rain, mist and fog that even the foot of the mountain takes a keen hiker to reach. It is a land of sparse vegetation, days-long enshrouding by clouds and weak winter sunshine. Naturally, the perfect place for some kind of wraith, yeti or ancient guardian to make its home. There have been numerous stories over the years of people who have seen or at least felt a presence atop that mountain. One of the major themes has always been this overwhelming feeling of terror and paralysing fear affecting those who have come into contact with the entity. There are also an abundance of theories as to what this presence is, both the more mundane, logical explanations, though Brock and Spectres are a cool concept I'll discuss later, through to the more interesting and wishful supernatural ones. We'll get to those theories in due course, but for now let's look at the stories of those who, over the course of centuries, believe they have encountered something strange up that there mountain. The earliest sighting on record is from 1791 by the poet James Hogg. He described it as a giant, at least 30 feet high. It came very close to him and he says he was struck powerless with astonishment and terror. Hogg was terrified of what he saw and he ran home and waited until the next day before going back to collect his sheep. I should have mentioned he took sheep up there. When he arrived back up the mountain, he claims he saw the creature again. Mustering his strength and fighting the will to flee, he decided to test a theory. He removed his hat and saw the creature did the same thing. Not that he said it was wearing a hat earlier, and that led him to believe that he was seeing his own shadow in the fog. But despite Hogg's decision that he hadn't seen a creature or presence on the mountain, he isn't the only one to have seen something up there and felt the eerie, unnerving terror that he described. The mountaineer Richard Frere shared his story from one of his friends who camped atop the mountain in 1940. He set his tent up by the cairn on the summit and once inside began to feel suddenly a sense of unease and disconnect or warping of reality. Despite this, he did manage to fall asleep, but woke up to the sight of moonlight shining into his tent. He then realised he could see a brown figure between himself and the moon. The sight terrified him and he sat still and silent waiting for the creature to leave. When it did, he chanced a look and poked out of the tent. He saw what he described as a brown creature swaggering away down the mountain, claiming it had an air of insolent strength. He guessed it at being 20 feet high, with an erect posture, broad shoulders and a tapering waist. Pause for people laughing at the word erect. It doesn't seem to be just Ben MacDui the creature can be found, but the surrounding area as well. Tom Crowley, former president of the Moray Mountaineering Club, said in the early 1920s that as he was coming down the peak to the west of MacDui, he saw a huge grey, mist-shrouded figure with pointed ears, long legs and finger-like talons. While this description isn't 100% the same as the other sightings, given the fog it always seems to be enveloped by and the abject terror those who see it feel, it's only naturally they might have gotten some elements wrong. Another off-mountain experience was that of renowned explorer and photographer James A. Rennie. In his book Romantic Strathspey, he wrote about photographs that he took of large, unusual footprints in the snow that he was unable to attribute to any known animal. I couldn't find a library copy of the book, and I wasn't going to spend an extortionate amount of money on it just to look for one photo, so I'm using the same picture that FYI used in their article about the creature. But if anyone has got a copy and can share the picture, then please do so. Rennie later attests that he visited the area again and saw that these footprints were actually caused by precipitation in the way that the rain eroded the snow, which makes me think that the picture that I'm using is just a random stock photo that FYI used for the article and isn't the one in question, given this is clearly not snow. But maybe Rennie was just backpedaling and this is the legit picture. Again, if you've got a copy, please share. Another story comes from Matt Lammy, who shared an account from 3 men who were exploring the forest in Deeside, which lies on the edge of the Cairngorms. They were walking through the forest when they came face to face with an eerie, dark, human-shaped figure. They saw a face peering at them from between branches, which they described as human, but not human. One of them threw a stone at the creature, very nice, which caused it to run away. They also claim several weeks later they were driving through that same part of the forest when the creature reappeared and chased them, managing to keep up with them even when they were going 45 miles an hour, before finally just giving up and watching them drive away. One of the most common reports for sightings, if we can call it that, is the sound of footsteps just behind you or to the side, always out of eye line. And when looking for the source of the noise, a lot of people simply didn't see anything. Hugh D. Welsh was climbing the summit with his brother in 1904 and reported hearing slurring footsteps as if someone was walking through water-saturated gravel. Allegedly, when they returned to the Derry Lodge after the climb, a fellow climber staying there told them, "That would have been the Fear Liath Mor you heard." What's important to note is this exchange is meant to have happened over a decade before the account by Professor J. Norman Colley, whose is perhaps the first high-profile account we have, which I'll discuss shortly. A similar claim comes from artist and author Wendy Wood, who claims that at some time in the 1920s she approached the Larrig Gru, a pass at the foot of the mountain, in which she heard a voice with gigantic resonance and seemed to be speaking Gaelic. She checked around and saw that she was alone, so she naturally hurried away. She thought as she ran that the echoes of footsteps were hers, until she realised they did not correspond with her footsteps at all. As I said before, perhaps the first high-profile account was from Professor J. Norman Colley. Now, this was a man highly respected as a scientist. He was Professor of Organic Chemistry at University College London. He was an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he even did the research that led to the first ever medical X-ray. So his credentials as a man of logic and reason were pretty on point. He was also a well-regarded mountaineer, regularly climbing and even mapping parts of Skye, climbing all around Scotland, as well as tackling climbs in the Alps, the Canadian Rockies and the Himalayas, including being involved in the first attempt to climb Nanga Parbat. His eponyms include Norman's Peak and Colley's Ledge in Skye, Colley's Pinnacle on mainland Scotland, and Mount Colley in Canada, one of over 30 peaks that he named on several trips there. So his credentials as a fearless and intrepid climber were also held in quite high esteem, which made it all the more shocking when this man, whose words carried a great deal of respect and weight, stood before the 27th annual general meeting of the Cairngorm Club in 1925 to tell his tale of an experience he had on Ben MacDui in 1891. "I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on and the eerie crunch sounded behind me, I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearby down to Rothiburker's forest. He went on to say that he told a man named Dr. Kellis about this experience, who shared a similar story one night in June, though which June he doesn't say. Dr. Kellis saw a man come out of the Larrig, which I think is Larrig Gru, the mountain pass I mentioned earlier. The man wandered around the cairn, which was at least 10 feet high, and this man was the same height. Dr. Kellis's brother had been sitting near the cairn, and after the man went back down the mountain, Kellis asked his brother what on earth was that man doing walking around the cairn, to which his brother replied, "I never saw any man at all." Colley also mentioned a Colin Phillip who met an old man living at the edge of Rothimercus Forest and was well familiar with the mountain range. When Phillip told the man Dr. Kellis's story, the man replied, "Oh aye, that would have been the Fear Liath Mor he would have been seeing." Colley finished, "Whatever you make of it, I do not know. But there is something very queer about the top of Ben MacDui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know." This is captured in the annual club journal for the Cairngorm Club itself, and from what it states, the press went wild after this, leading to a lot of interviews of and correspondence with club members, with the author stating the heading Ben MacDui Ghost or Ben MacDui Spectre becoming a familiar one in the newspapers. He states that while some dismissed it as nerves, others recounted weird feelings in the mist, or even recalled tales of ghost armies in parts of the Cairngorms, which would have been really useful for my Ghost Army video. The author finishes by saying no further light, however, was thrown upon Professor Colley's adventure, and the matter is chronicled here and left to the judgment of the individual reader. But what Professor Colley's adventure did stir up was the opening for several more otherwise respected and regarded climbers to share their own experiences on Ben MacDui, ones they hadn't shared before in case they were ridiculed. In 1939, Alistair Borthwick released Always a Little Further, a novel inspired by his newspaper columns about how the previously elitist activities of rock climbing and mountaineering in Scotland were being appropriated by the Glaswegian working class. In this novel, he shares the accounts of two climbers he knew who had experienced the presence of the Big Grey Man. He writes, "The first was alone. Headed over MacDui for Curragh on a night when the snow had a hard, crisp crust through which his boots broke at every step. He reached the summit, and it was while he was descending the slopes which fall towards the Larrig that he heard the footsteps behind him, footsteps not in the rhythm of his own, but occurring only once for every 3 steps he took. I felt a queer, crinkly feeling in the back of my neck," he told me, "but I said to myself, this is silly, there must be a reason for it. So I stopped, and the footsteps stopped, and I sat down and tried to reason it out. I could see nothing. There was a moon about somewhere, but the mist was fairly thick. The only thing I could make of it was that when my boots broke through the snow crust, they made some sort of echo. But then every step should have echoed, and not just this regular 1 in 3. I was scared stiff. I got up and walked on, trying hard not to look behind me. I got down all right. The footsteps stopped 1,000 feet above the Larrig, and I didn't run. But if anything had so much as said boo behind me, I'd have been down to Curragh like a streak of lightning." The second man's experience was roughly similar. He was on MacDui and alone. He heard footsteps. He was climbing in daylight in summer, but so dense was the mist that he was working by compass, and visibility was almost as poor as it would have been at night. The footsteps he heard were made by something or someone trudging up the fine screes which decorated the upper parts of the mountain. A thing not extraordinary in itself, though the steps were only a few yards behind him, but exceedingly odd when the mist suddenly cleared and he could see no living thing on that mountain, at that point devoid of cover of any kind. "Did the steps follow yours exactly?" I asked him. "No," he said. "That was the funny thing, they didn't. They were regular alright, but the queer thing was that they seemed to come once for every 2.5 steps I took." He thought it queerer still when I told him the other man's story. You see, he was long-legged and 6 feet tall, and the first man was only 5 feet 7. Once I was out with a search party on MacDui, and on the way down after an unsuccessful day, I asked some of the gamekeepers and stockers who were there with us what they thought of it all. They worked on MacDui, so they should know. Had they seen Fear Liath Mor? Did he exist? or was it just a silly story? They looked at me for a few seconds, and then one said, "We do not talk about that." Interestingly, Collie's experience and both accounts in Borthwick's book share a similarity to the account from Wendy Wood. Admittedly, Collie's famous speech was 5 years before Wood's book, which had come out 9 years before Borthwick's, and all would have had a decent familiarity amongst the Scottish adventuring community, so maybe they were all in on it. The final account related to Collie is one from the June 1958 issue of the Scots magazine, of which I could not find a copy. Mountaineer Alex Tunian had spent 10 days climbing in the Cairngorms in October 1943. No idea why it took him 15 years to tell his story, and he writes as follows. "One afternoon, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben MacDui, mist swirled across the Lairg Grew and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and an odd sound echoed through the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. Then another, and another. I am not unduly imaginative, but my thought flew instantly to the well-known story of Professor Collie in the Fear Liath Mor. Then I felt the reassuring weight of the loaded revolver in my pocket. Grasping the butt, I peered about in the mist, here rent and tattered by the eddies of the wind. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and headed down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I have never bettered. You may ask, was it really the Fear Liath Mor? Frankly, I think it was. Many times since then I have traversed MacDui in the mist, bivouacked out in the open, camped on its summit for days on end on different occasions, often alone and always with an easy mind. For on that day I am convinced I shot the only Fear Liath Mor my imagination will ever see. When I'm researching stories like this, either for this channel or my own amusement, when it comes to middle of nowhere, up in the mountains or out in the forest matters, I like to consult hiking and climbing forums. You may remember from my Louis Belt Lodge video that a lot of chatter about the haunting was shared on there. This is mainly because back in the 50s and earlier, researchers went out and gathered stories in places like climbers clubs and local taverns, and then wrapped them all up into a book that is sometimes accessible via the Internet Archive, sometimes kind of cheap on Amazon, and most of the time quoted in other articles without easy access to the source material. But these days, those stories don't necessarily need to be gathered, because the people who tell them gather themselves. They flock to forums instead of waiting for reporters to flock to them, and these forums now seem to act in the same way as something like Rupert Gould's book did in the Loch Ness Monster video that I had way back when. One such story I found on these forums was from a poster called Daisy, who wrote, "I'd believe any story I heard about ghosts and ghoulies on Ben MacDui. I went up a few years back with some friends. It was late September and the weather was atrocious. You know, the sort of horizontal rain that stings as it hits your face. A friend of mine was picked up by the wind and thrown 6 feet in the air and flung 15 feet away. I thought he'd broken his back as he landed. I'll admit I was scared, but that's more to do with the elements than ghosts though. There is a certain eeriness up there, don't you think? I've not experienced it before going on that trip." That certain eeriness is pervasive to say the least. We heard about it from James Hogg over 300 years ago, we heard about it from Professor Collie, and we're even hearing about it from modern day climbers. Hugh D. Welsh, who I mentioned earlier, reported feeling an eerie feeling of apprehension, as did Richard Frere's friend, who felt a presence utterly abstract but intensely real. Something else to note about Richard Frere's friend, he reportedly heard an intensely high singing note when he had his encounter. This is in contrast to any of the other sightings, especially Wendy Wood with that gigantic resonance, but it did resonate with another story I found. When I was looking at the hiking forums, one fellow posted to say he was hiking with a bird-watching friend who got really excited because he could hear a golden plover. It was really quite loud, so obviously near, and the mist wasn't too thick. But looking around for over 10 minutes, we couldn't spot it anywhere. And the funny thing was that neither of us could decide the direction the noise was coming from. They put it down to being the grey plover of Ben MacDui, but in case you didn't know, this is what a golden plover sounds like. So either Richard Frere's friend also heard a plover he just couldn't see, or maybe this is one of the noises the potential spirit guardian of the mountain makes. And since we're talking about what it could potentially be, let's move on to theories. First, let's get the boring scientific likely explanations out of the way. As far as the footsteps people hear are concerned, there are a couple of things that could be. For one, the geology of the summit at MacDui, as well as the ecological and meteorological makeups are concerned, noise can be both amplified and inconsistent, so hearing your own footsteps louder but not at the same rate as you're making them is a real possibility. The other explanation is the fluctuating temperature up there. As anyone who's been mountaineering can tell you, fog is cold, and as it changes in thickness, the temperature changes as well. It can also get quite icy up there. Both of these conditions can impact the expansion and contraction of the rocks and can cause them to split. This obviously affects the stability of the rock formations up there and causes them to move and tumble, so even on a mild day the rocks make noises. That accounts for the footsteps, but what about the visions some people have? The accepted explanation is something called the Brocken spectre. This is a phenomenon where if the sun shines behind the observer and into the mist or fog, the observer's shadow is cast upon the cloud. Due to the perspective, the shadow is larger and stretched out, making the appearance of a tall figure, and the potential appearance of a halo-like aura around the figure just adds to the mysticism. It can't occur just anywhere, as the requirement for seeing one is steep cliffs or high peaks, as you need to be angled above the cloud for the effect to take. But there is an area on Ben MacDui called Lurcher's Crag, tall cliffs that look over the northern entrance to Lerrig Grew, which, as we've seen, seems to crop up in the stories quite frequently. This is an ideal spot for seeing the Brocken spectre if conditions are right, so it could well be why people witnessed that vision in that particular area. Another thing that debunkers have pointed out is that while Colley commanded a lot of respect and told his story in a somewhat official capacity, his biographer Christine Mill did point out that he was a lifelong believer of the occult. When the media frenzy about the Loch Ness Monster occurred in 1933, he believed that too, despite never seeing it. And it is pointed out that he never saw the big grey man either, merely hearing what he thought was footsteps and being overcome by the pervasive sense of dread. Mill also wrote that he loved to tell stories like this, often regaling campfires with tales of gods and monsters and other supernatural creatures, and Mill is quoted as saying he told these stories with no one quite knowing how much he was believing himself. So maybe he did love a good story and decided to troll his mountaineering club with the same type of tale he'd tell around a campfire. The more fun theories are of course the ones that lean into the supernatural and our favourite theories here on the Spectred Isle. One of the more common theories from this side of the fence is that the big grey man is a distant cousin of Bigfoot. They do share some common features. They're tall, they're hairy, and anyone who claims to have seen them is written off as a moron. And interestingly, while Bigfoot is usually placed in the mountains and forests of the Pacific Northwest, there have been reports of sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature in the Appalachian Mountains. Why is this interesting? Because back in the days of Pangaea, when all of the Earth was connected in one big supercontinent, the Appalachians and the Cairngorms were part of the same mountain range, the Central Pangaean Mountains. So to see similar creatures in both isn't that big of a stretch. That being said, by the Jurassic period, marine basins had begun to form within the chains and the two ranges were separated. And since this was 200 million years ago, it's just a teeny bit before any humanoid mammals were expected to have evolved. Another theory I've seen proposed is that the grey man is a bodhisattva. I'm not going into loads of detail about this, but to be as basic as possible, this is a term from Buddhism which describes spiritually heroic people who have achieved the highest level of enlightenment, Buddhahood, but only so they can work for the benefit of all sentient beings. instincts. I think this is probably linked to another theory that the man is there to guard a portal of some kind, perhaps even a gateway to Agartha, the legendary kingdom inside the earth that makes up a lot of Hollow Earth theories. An offshoot of those theories is that there is another gateway in the Himalayas and the Yetis are guardians of that one. Himalayas links us to Buddhism, which links us to Bodhisattvas, and here we go full circle. It's a deep rabbit hole to go down that I won't go into here. Maybe rabbit holes are also a gateway to Agartha. Speaking of guardians, that's another top theory for what this man is. Maybe just an ancient spirit that guards the mountain itself from ne'er-do-wells and the like. Think back to that story on the forum posted by Daisy. Maybe it wasn't the wind that picked up her friend and chucked them 15 feet away. Maybe they were up to no good, and the mountain spirit decided to warn them off. Sticking with the guardian of a portal theory, another suggestion is that he is one of the She and is guarding a portal to their dimension. The She are Fae that have the ability to pop between our world and the world of the fairy. A lot of mythological creatures around Scotland and Ireland are purported to be members of that family and like to cause a good deal of mischief when they show up. Maybe the big grey man is one of their own, guarding a portal between their world and ours. So what do I think about the mysterious presence atop Ben MacDui? Well, the scientific explanations are all there and do largely explain the visions and noises people have experienced. By now you've probably realised that while I'm a rational, logical man, I also have a longing desire for the magical side of our culture to be real. Like Fox Mulder, I want to believe. The hubris of man is our unwavering, egotistical steadfastness that we're always right. Magic isn't real and you're an idiot if you think it is. Cryptids aren't real and you're a sensationalist conspiracy theorist with too much time on your hands if you think they are. Despite the fact that 85% of the world's population subscribe to a religious belief, we've never been more sceptical. We've come to a point where instead of fearing what we don't know, we reject it. Like with the debunkers for Collie, where believing in the occult results in being automatically discredited. The occult is a pretty wide category when it comes to belief, so how can we be sure 100% of it is false? Historians and archaeologists and other researchers have spent centuries unpicking the stories of the Bible to find truth in faith, and while we've not been able to prove a lot of it either way, there are people in there and stories in there that we've concluded stand a good chance of having actually existed. If we accept that religious beliefs at least have some threads of truth within their texts, why is the occult written off as a complete fabrication, unless maybe there are things the powers that be want you to dismiss? So yeah, maybe there is some ancestral, spiritual guardian of the old gods up Ben MacDui still carrying out its eternal duty to protect whatever it's there to protect. The more you look into the mythological, the supernatural, the more you see patterns in belief and human behaviour. Practically every culture has ghosts and spirits and antlered gods and elemental guardians and so on. And there are certain instincts that we all have, primal triggers left in place throughout evolution. And it makes me wonder what exactly our common ancestors experienced or lived with or feared that means all these millennia later our DNA still tells us to be scared of the dark. And it's that instinctual fear that permeates throughout these stories from Ben MacDui, the certain eeriness, as Daisy puts it, which none of the science can explain. Sure, the footsteps are just the natural movement of rocks, and the misty figures are just reflections of our shadows on the mist. But why are we still so afraid? The question is beautifully summed up by Peter Densham, who was leader of the Cairngorms RAF rescue team during World War II. He writes, "Tell me that the wine was but the result of relaxed eardrums, and the presence was only the creation of a mind that was accustomed to take too great an interest in such things. I shall not be convinced. Come rather with me at the mysterious dusk time when day and night struggle upon the mountains. Feel the night wind on your faces and hear it crying amid rocks. See the desert uplands consumed before the racing storms. Though your nerves be of steel, and your mind says it cannot be, you will be acquainted with that fear without name, that intense dread of the unknown that has pursued mankind from the very dawn of time." Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe in the big grey man of Ben MacDui or not, and what to believe he might be if you do, and also if you choose to believe that I was putting 100% effort into those accents. But as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.